Elia, you and I have had a chance to go out shooting before. I've watched you work. I have the immense respect because the way that you approach photography is with such great patience. You study the scene, you think about it, you keep revisiting a location, you take the time to get to know the people because I think I'm guessing here, but you could probably describe it better. When you're capturing a photo of a place, you really want that to be truly and honestly representative of the place. You're not just trying to get the stereotypical image from a place. You really try to look for something that you feel connected to. Is that a fair way of describing it?
It is, and it's kind of evolved, I guess, because the idea behind it initially was to embody emotion or encapsulate an emotional response, right? And I learned which locations do that. You know, people see little villages in Italy, they see Greece, they see places like that, and they've either been there, they want to go there, they have memories of it. It invokes something, a feeling, and that developed the style into blending time together to try to encapsulate more emotions as far as a range of a memory from sunset to blue hour. And I think that over time, I learned that it was more the people and the experiences that I was drawn to rather than the photography, though the photography was like the initial reason to go. So that's kind of come full circle to me, to be more important to me, you know, getting to the root of the story and making sure that the image, yeah, it encapsulates the beauty of a location and everything. But I want people that live there to be proud of their place too. And I think that's what I've learned is, connecting with so many friends all over the world. Everybody's really proud of their heritage. They're proud of where they come from. You know, they know there's something beautiful, or when you discover something that tourists don't know that they know about. And I'm really trying to encourage that, and while doing that, encouraging community. So it's all kind of factored into my images, and it's sort of factoring into what I'm going to create later, since I've had a lot of time to think about it. But it all does come down to, showing it in its best, can we say light, so to
Yeah.
speak?
Yeah, that's our business light. We pay attention to the light. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing some of your techniques. One of the things I've noticed about your approach to editing is you aren't afraid to take control and take time, but you also don't feel obligated to just move every single slider and jiggle them until you find something you like. Like you kind of study the image and you kind of make concentric circles around it. Like you keep refining the image and you keep moving in towards where you want. But it's clear to me that I think that you've already seen in your mind what this picture is going to look like when you were taking it. I think you have a vision that carries from planning it when you're doing your research to landing there to actually accomplishing it. But one thing I've learned from you that I immensely respect is you've taught me to slow down rather than hunting around trying to find 5 or 6 different angles of the same place, decide on the best angle, and then stay put and keep shooting because the light's going to keep changing. And you're not exactly sure which picture is going to be best because the light changes. That's the one thing we can't control. We can control where we go, we can control the angle or the composition, but light's not under our control.
That's right. You kind of have to break it down into, yeah, it's one vision, and then two, there are controlled variables. You know that hopefully the city's going to be there, things like that. And then there's variables that are outside of your control, and that's for the most part weather, even though you can average it, and seasons, and there's a lot of things you can do, but you have to almost schedule spontaneity. So what I learned early on is that when the vision is too strong, unless you're familiar with the place, it can hold you back from experimentation, and what you actually didn't know you wanted in the end, because you get so locked into this idea. And it could be as simple as like epic sunset, like obsessed with it. I've been obsessed with these, and then I get it in a lightning storm and I'm like, wow, that's so much better. I never even thought to do that. So you gotta understand that I guess the very intentive, like specific approach to editing, which is your intention to change something, right? We do that once we're comfortable with what we want, but it shouldn't always be that way. Especially when we're starting out, we need to experiment, and that's the slider mentality. And certainly when we're first starting, that's when we're kind of sliding things to the left and the right. And I find that sometimes, I'll even get to an image where I'm like, I think this is close, but then I'll experiment a little bit with sliders. it's not a better or worse eye doctor situation, where I'm trying everything, but I am using some templates. I'm just trying to think outside of the box, because no matter how long you do this, and actually if you do it for a long time, you'll conform to something. You'll repeat procedures even if you try not to be procedural. It's just our nature to form habits in this stuff. So it's one of those things where you have to accept whether or not your vision comes to light, and sometimes you have to appreciate what you have if you don't have time to go back. So that's certainly something I've learned over time. And in fact, all the images that we're going to look at today are all outtakes. They never made the portfolio because there's no sky, but we have a tool for that.
Yeah, and actually this is a cool point, which is we now have seen changes in technology, both the processing and the cameras and computing power. I've found myself going back to raw files that maybe I even shot 15 years ago, and the technology I have today lets me take some of those photos I marked as rejects and make them look amazing. So like some of the problems I encountered, and like I said, when we went shooting, I was just glad to see that you don't have like a special relationship with the weather gods. You have the exact same problems I have, which is like, okay, this is the fourth time I've gotten up at 6 a.m. and damn it, the sky hasn't come out. So,
Well, I mean, there were reasons why there were multiple sky gods in Greek mythology.
yeah, because
You
no one
never
ever
really
liked one
know.
of them.
No, and you have to pray to the different ones depending on the trade winds and everything. That was a lot when you're sailing culture. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and I think that even though we try to do something in a specific way, it also kind of it begs to be simplified. And that's what I'm always trying to do. I want to simplify the method because I don't feel like it's complex, but I feel like I can easily make it overly complex for no reason. So what I do is I constantly kind of reassess my editing, my shooting, and I kind of figure out what makes most sense. Like years ago, I used to press the camera shutter over and over and over and over again because I felt like I was doing something. And then I just kind of figured out, what? There's an interval timer mode. Do I really need to be pressing this button over and over again? Can I just do that and walk away? Yes, I can. And Rich, you said something that's really interesting too. We have been so spoiled lately with the new raw files, new software, the capabilities of dynamic range and cameras and everything. Problems we had to overcome in 2010 and 12 are not what we have to overcome today. We have the luxury of saying, hey, that one little specific color around that pixel range is wrong. Let's change it. Before it was like, man, I don't have a sky at all. I have to combine 7 or 9 exposures together. And that's not that long ago. So we have to remember that. But we also have to think about it in terms of, is this editing style relevant to what we are doing today? And I think that's what I really challenge myself with. And let's go ahead and optimize this too with an open Luminar. A lot of what I've kind of been doing lately is rethinking it. And rethinking it doesn't mean reinventing the wheel, right? Like we don't want to do that. And in the last session, if you watch that, I covered some different tools, and I'm going to cover them really quickly. And then I'm going to move on to how to how to really get the most of these outtakes or these sky replacements and talk about that. But the idea is, if you're old like me and Richard, who's older than me, we've been shooting for a long time. We've been using software for a long time, and basically things have changed, but a lot of the processes have remained the same. And the reason for that is because they're actually really simple. If you think about shooting in a raw file, you're shooting the raw to encapsulate all of the data, right? Like we want all of the things. It's not just what we're seeing on the back of the camera. We're able to move the shadows and the highlights and the exposure and the white balance and create what really is getting close to being a 100% non-linear shooting process. And that's even getting bigger with depth mapping and also the other things that Apple's doing. It's insane what we're coming into this world. And the AI is pushing a lot of that. We have so many more choices. And it begs to the question of, if these tools were there 10 years ago, would we be doing things the same way? And if we take a look at this screen right here, and a good way to kind of illustrate that, and I'll go over this really quickly, and then I'll get on to some new things. And I'm assuming all of this will be viewable at some point. Mine's probably going to be edited down to like 3 minutes, because that's like the maximum time I'm actually going to have useful information in any of these, but there will be something there. This is a really simple scene. Again, all of these on the bottom of the film strip, we're going to look at a couple of them. Those are all sky replacements. This one doesn't have it. But when I shoot, like Richard said, at least one of the cameras is very deliberate. It's there. I'm leaving it there, setting it in interval mode, shooting every few minutes or, every few seconds, whatever it takes, depending on the way the light's changing. And then I'll probably shoot to manual or switch to actually controlling it when it gets more critical at nighttime, or of course, astrophotography. There are times when you need to control the settings, but for the most part, I'll even automate bracketing 3, 5, 7, whatever I think it takes. These days, 3 is like more than I need. But for the most part, I'm trying to edit a single raw and not blend them together unless I have to. So often things look like this, and we have to get them to here. And that's not a really big change. But if we really start to think about this, and I reset it, the classic mentality of all of the years I've been editing is to use the equivalent of the light panel, which is universal now on pretty much every mobile device with some bells and whistles. It's in Lightroom, Capture One, whatever, you name it, it's there. And it's the simple art of balancing the exposure and the raw file. So most of the time I'm having to adjust the shadows. Most of the time I'm having to pull the highlights down, the blacks, a little bit of the white balance change, the tint, the exposure, all of these things to pull the histogram back to the middle. So it's not, as bad as it was, or as, straight out of camera as it was. But we can rethink this, because what we all do, myself included in Lightroom, especially when I have a lot of things to work on it, I hit the auto button just to see if it works. Sometimes it actually does. It's pretty impressive. It takes things too far, but it's a starting point. The reason that an auto button that doesn't have AI technology works is it's not that complicated. Most of my images are going to require the same exact thing. They're going to need more boost in the shadows. They're going to need highlights and everything. So if we had a way to intelligently do this and automate it, make it a smart process, why wouldn't we use it? So if something like Enhance AI existed from the beginning, and all I had to do was slide Accent AI or one slider to get mostly there while adding the contrast in, why would I use the light if this is already doing that to the raw file? So then we start to think about, this is what I'm trying to get the file to begin post-processing. I'm just trying to get the shadows and highlights balanced. Now I can fine tune. So when you think about it this way with Enhance, we can do a little bit of fine tuning. Maybe the shadows need to come up a little bit more. What I showed in the last one that I was on, I think it was 1030, but those will be on for view, is that we also have tools that replicate things like luminosity masking. So where you could go into the raw, tweak this a little bit, shadows, midtones, highlights, fine tune it. There are complex ways to do it that aren't necessarily necessary. Yeah, I guess that works. In other words, it's a complex way of doing something simple that you do need sometimes, but I try not to make things complex for the sake of complexity. Like, for example, I could walk out of my house doing a handstand and walking on my hands, but aside from everybody being impressed that I can actually do it, I'm probably just going to walk out on my feet. So sometimes the simple answer is the answer. And when we're talking about doing things in a raw process, it gets more powerful. So super contrast kind of emulates the luminosity masking in that it allows us to individually isolate, select these 3 elements, highlights, midtones, and shadows, and adjust them accordingly. But what it's going to do is it's going to also maintain the contrast. So where it's going to boost these things, it's also going to add contrast in as well. So it's going to give a more rich result than the light panel, because we're going to have to add contrast in later globally. So this allows you to control specific areas. Now that's really important. So let's go ahead and reset this. And I want to talk about how, this was an easy thing to get to. We know that we can do this very quickly just using Enhance AI. But all of these files, if we look at them, no matter how complex they look, even this one that we use is a demo, and this was printed super large at a fine art gallery. This started as a reject shot. There's no sky, there's no anything there. So it was the perfect testing for sky replacement. But if we look at these things, we really have to think about it in terms of what is realistic, right? And it's kind of unfair to say realistic when we're putting a sky in, but it's something that I've done for years. And I think a lot of people are really shocked to hear that clients ask for it all the time. I mean, like international big clients, and the blue sky just isn't selling it, unless it's a beach vacation and somebody wants a blue sky, that's a different story. But for, gallery work and things, you'd be surprised how many people are actually doing it, but it's a painful process. So just because we have that solution like Sky AI, And you can see how easy this is when you just click sky selection. You can put anything there. And the masking is, for the most part, really good. And we can fine tune that. But just because we can doesn't mean that it works. And I think this is the really interesting thing about sky replacement, because I want to cover in the next 10 minutes what it does very well. But I also want to cover the sort of dangers with it, right? And this is kind of a cool image to look at that. Right now, obviously that's a really cool sky, right? Like it's in the Sunset collection that I released, and it's also, I think it's the Blue Hour and the Sunset collection. I have them kind of mixed in here, but I call this getting greedy. So everybody likes a fiery sunset, it's nice. Obviously we want this, but it's pretty obvious that it doesn't work, right? Like this is kind of a Blue Hour. It's kind of a dull scene in that it has a lot of green. This sky is just not realistic. So we have to keep it in the realm of believability, or at least in the context of some sort of reality. If we start to get too crazy, Milky Way and all that, you can see, obviously these things, you turn this into a client and well, I don't know, it depends on the client these days. Maybe they do want the Milky Way, but for the most part, we have to fit things in that make sense. You have to think about sky replacement in terms of not only what fits the scene from a directional sun aspect or a light aspect or a time aspect, Blue Hour, sunset, golden hour, things like that. We also want to take into consideration the composition. We need to take into consideration, does this sky detract from the foreground? If I was shooting a sequence of this and I had the most epic sky, I probably wouldn't use that sky with the Blue Hour because it's just too much. It's visual overload. You don't want all the attention to be on the sky. You want to balance it. And that's very important. So when we start to pick something really close, then we can start talking about fine tuning it. And what I'm doing here is just, I'm bringing, since this was so underexposed, I'm just kind of exaggerating a little bit of the adjustment here like I was before. So we can kind of see how the bounce light's going to kind of work. Now, the first thing with the sky, once you realize that it's going to work and masking looks good, you identify something that looks right. Obviously, the light direction is really important. And here it kind of works either way because it's later in the Blue Hour. The sun did set over here on the side of the mountain on the right. So either way, this doesn't really scream left to right orientation with the sky. The composition kind of matches, creates this nice circular position here. And then the horizon blending, you can see, since it was sort of a percentage of itself into itself, in other words, these tones of the sky kind of already match the tones of the sky I'm putting in. So it will blend easily. And that's really important. Now, obviously, we can change position of horizon, mask refinement if we start to see things around the edges. If I have time, I can show one more example where we can use that. Now, probably the most important thing, and one of the things that's kind of overlooked in sky replacement is whether we do this with Luminar, or whether we do this with, manually and Photoshop with layers and masking and everything, we can do that, right? Like whether you cut out every little pixel yourself or you automate it. But what really transforms the scene is the relighting. Obviously the fiery sunset didn't work. We can't bounce that much light onto a Blue Hour scene. But here's where you can really take advantage of that, because Luminar intelligently relights things. And you can see that it's not just relighting the scene itself and flooding it with some of these values, but it's also taking into consideration the sky and the blending points. And then we can also change the saturation to pull that up. So if we had humans in the scene, which I try very hard to exclude from my scenes, we'd be able to relight the human. So it's human aware, and that's really important too. And then obviously here is very nice, like we have a reflection. So we have a reflection amount and also a blur. So this is where the baseline kind of starts. And it's important to understand once you have it, editing it down. So a good example of that would have been if I didn't do any editing to it originally. It's very dark, but since I did a little bit, what I'm going to do is kind of match it. So if you do have a sky that's a little bit too intense, a little bit too distracting, it's very easy to use atmospheric haze to kind of mute it a little bit. So we can soften it out and then match the tones of the scene. Every scene's different. Every atmosphere is different. We can also make it warmer. So if we want to warm this down or cool it down to make it feel like a Blue Hour. So all of these things can be adjusted, focused, and grained to better match. And once it's matched, everything that we do here is going to be done to both the sky and the foreground. So even something like this, the AI sky enhancer, can be used on this. So it's a really fast way to be able to put everything together, but you have to kind of choose the right sky. So this is, again, something that I demoed in the last one, and I just put the sky in. What I want to do actually with this one is reset it so we can talk about it. Because this one is a completely different scene shot at golden hour, so it requires a little bit different attention. Obviously, every scene's going to be different. So having a good sky library is very important. So every time you're outside and there's nothing going on in the foreground, it's your backyard, whatever, you have a clear view, take photos of the sky. Whether it's a regular just photo with your camera, whatever you have, you can actually stretch them a lot further than you think, because the more you have, the more you can find that fit. Like, for example, here we can try something epic again. Does it work? And very quickly, we're probably going to find out that no, it doesn't work. So let's tone it down a little bit. Don't be as greedy. That's a little bit better. But I feel like this one, it's something where you have some interest on the right side. So it kind of works with the scene in that it brings the attention through it rather than away from it. Because Santorini and Ia, this little town, this little village, is so much detail, we don't want to get away from it. And that's where we can start to do some fun stuff. So we already see there are some issues and artifacts here. So the first thing is that horizon blending. What we can do is just start to pull this into itself, which is really nice because this automatically had some haze on the water. So a little bit of atmospheric, marine layer, basically. And then we can also take into account the refinement. So the closing gaps here, we'll kind of tune that in. We can fix the details a little bit, and very quickly, just with a little tuning, we can fix all of those little things. It'll go in and it'll reassess it. But here's where it gets really fun. So one, we have the relighting. So you can see that it's really going to pull this down. We can relight it here, but here's where we can get even more creative. Down at the bottom, where I was showing you before, the atmospheric haze, the warmth, and the brightness, here's what's interesting. So if we can say that this scene is mostly warm, the sky is mostly warm. If I warm it up, now it's going to mimic the adjustments in the sky, and it's also going to apply them. You can see it applying to the highlights, especially right in this area. So that scene-aware lighting actually does manipulate and independently manipulates the shadows, midtones, and highlights. It's not just putting a big color overlay. So we can start to tune this into something that looks a little bit more blended, right? Like it looks a little bit better. And then once that's done, then we can do all the fun stuff. We need a little bit of X and AI, a little bit of the sky enhancer. We can do that. We can come down to what I did before, the super contrast. And you can see as I start to do this, you can see that we're adding value inside of the highlight regions as opposed to the light where I'm actually just taking the highlights back. You can see it's pulling the highlights back. And another note about that is the light panel always stays independent for the foreground if you need to make fine-tune areas of selection here. In other words, if this doesn't match up with this, you can always tune it here in light. But what happens is when you're pulling everything to the left or the right on the histogram, it's not really considering what's in between. So in order to take advantage of what we call quarter tones, and that's really defining what's between that area of highlight that we're trying to adjust, that's where super contrast comes in. So here you can see it even fills in some of the color. Shadow contrast, same thing. It's sort of filling out those areas that are dark while adding contrast, and we can even pick up the mid-tone contrast a little bit. And from here, we can start to get a nice result, and we can add quite a few different things. Well, the other thing that I showed before, and this goes into, I know it was part of the first one. So if you've seen both, thank you for watching. Again, this will probably total about 6 minutes of useful information when they edit it. I used a couple other things. Like we talked about the lighting, we talked about how that bounces to the object. We also talked about color cast. So this has a large blue color cast. So classic mentality for me is to just go right into the color channels, go right into the saturation, remove the blue so we get white buildings, and then mask it, right? Like that's a pretty safe way to do it. I've done it a million times. I can do it with masking here in Photoshop, but it's all just color. So if we understand how color works and complementary color or just warm against cool, we can start to look at it in terms of what's warm that needs to be cooled down or what's cool that needs to be warmed up. And when you flood a blue value with a red or yellow or warm value, you're going to start to neutralize it. And same thing is opposite here. So I can actually manipulate the warm colors with split color warmth and just affect the sky. And you can see I can very quickly destroy it. And I can also cool it down. So here's how I could tone it down and make it a little bit more mute or closer to a blue hour. But in a similar way, the cool tones are what I'm trying to manipulate, and I can just warm those up. So another way of thinking about it, you can see here, and we'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit so it's easier to see. We start thinking about this as just moving color around on a palette. So what I always like to do is I try to add color rather than remove it. And in RGB, it really doesn't matter, but it's kind of like an old rich black CMYK thing from back in the day. I won't really date myself with that. But the nice thing is when you're flooding it with color, you're neutralizing a color rather than removing it. And what's cool about that is you can see that it's protecting all the other tones. So even when I neutralize the blues of the buildings, it's still keeping this area intact. The blues aren't that different. And if I take a look at before and after, you can see you can't really notice that difference. Where when I remove the saturation, obviously every blue tone, these blues, everything, and very specifically the blues of the door, because that saturation of that blue value is totally independent of luminance, right? Like it's going to pull all the blue value out. We're flooding it with color. Even if I break all the color everywhere else, that blue is only going to turn into basically a shade of purple because it's dark. So this allows you to go in and not have to mask around all those blue doors. They're supposed to be blue. And if I get really picky and I want to keep the blue in the sky here, I can very easily just say, you know what, let's go ahead and erase that area. So we won't even consider messing with this area. So it's that fast to have control. And the nice thing too, about loading everything in Luminar. It works great as a plugin too, but when I load these images into Luminar, every single one of these processes is actually happening to the raw file, which is pretty cool. Even Sky AI is happening to the raw file. Everything here is basically a nonlinear process. And when you work in raw, you can get the most out of the image. Will this end up getting exported to Photoshop? Yeah, probably. I mean, there are a lot of distracting objects, these people, lots of photographers down there. They're very annoying too. We have to remove them, things like that. But I know that since I've done all this in RAW, it's going to have the best sort of pixel for pixel value. I know that if I reproduce this large, it's going to be high quality, it's going to be seamless, it's going to be really good. So even with a few minutes or just a few of these extra tools, you can do most of the heavy lifting without having to do any heavy lifting at all.
Elia, this has been excellent. We're at towards the end of our window, but first up, I did share just in the chat, you recorded a ton of great tutorials with us, some long ones, some short ones, some deep dives. I put the link there to YouTube, so where people can quickly with one click search our channel, and you've just got a wealth of knowledge there, so that was excellent. I really appreciate you sharing this info. Is there any other place you'd like people to go for some resources to learn more from you?
Yeah, it's pretty easy these days with social media, but my website, elialocardi.com, probably isn't updated because,
Been
it's
busy.
me we're talking about. But yeah, you can find most of the things there, links to photographing the world, free tutorials, talks, and things like that.